Hey, what's going on YouTube? It's your man Soul. Welcome back to the channel. You know what it is when you clicked it. And I'm back. I haven't recorded for a little bit and I felt like I owe that to the YouTube community and all the subscribers because, like I said, it's been some time. I'm sure everyone just like myself has been enjoying the leveling process, the gear grinding process, the raiding process, so on and so forth. And I feel like after such a hard grind, because I really kind of hit the ground running when Wrath released, I just needed like a cool off period, you know what I mean? So cool off period has ended. I'm back, gonna be, re-uploading content as close to a regular basis as I can see fit. Let me just adjust my monitor here. And yeah, we should just get back to regularly scheduled programming. So for this sole discussion, just gonna be going over some things that I've been noticing. As you can see, I got the Wowhead website up. And we're just going to talk about some shit that's popped up. Once again, if you are new to the channel and you like what you see, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel out greatly as we make it down the long road to 1K. But now that we got that housekeeping shit out the way, let's get to the real things. Alright, so let's talk about Naxx, Eye of Eternity, Obsidian Sanctum, Phase 1 as a whole, right? And I will say this. Phase 1 is still just as easy, just as face roll, just as boring as what I remember it to be in original Wrath release. Now, keep in mind, I wasn't a super hardcore raider back then. I wasn't even half as skilled as I was now. As I am now, I should say. But I still remember, these 3 raids not being that crazy of a challenge. It was new, it was great. I wasn't over it like how I am now, but yeah, I don't know. Now, a video I had put out a couple weeks ago said that Naxx seemingly got a 30% buff to the bosses, right? And that was just due to the health pool that I seen on the Wrath Classic Beta of Patchwork and the health pool that I saw in a video from the original Wrath Naxx on Patchwork, and his health was about 30% more. That's not to say that his damage output was 30% more, but it was just, comparative, 30% more health. So I just made the assumption that he did 30% more damage. Let's say that's true. Let's say that reasoning is the case, right? With that being said, a 30% buff still just wasn't enough in my opinion. Not enough for it to be a challenge. And while I am incredibly bored with Phase 1 already, and it's kind of crazy because it's not like my Death Knight is in full pre-raid bis yet, right? Or not pre-raid, in full Phase 1 bis, because he's not. I still got some pieces to pick up, right? I just don't see Naxx, Eye of Eternity, or Obsidian Sanctum just really maintaining my interest for however many months we have of Phase 1. Let's just assume it's going to be 3 to 4, right? That seems to be the staple for these phases in Classic. So, and I do want to point out one thing that I had mentioned before in another video. I had said that Naxx isn't going to be difficult, and it maybe doesn't have to be, and I still stand by that, right? It doesn't have to be super difficult. Phase 1 it really is just so you can prepare for Ulduar, because Ulduar is really where things scale up, mechanics scale up, damage output scales up, the damage required to kill a boss scales up, everything just gets that little boost, right? So that being said, we're just using the Phase 1 raids as stepping stones, and that's kind of been the trend really for later expansions. It's like the Phase 1 or the first tier raids aren't really that difficult. They don't really need to be that difficult. There are some one-off fights that kind of shake things up. For Naxx, that's probably like the safety dance, which now you don't even die to if you get hit. You can get hit like 3-4 times and you still won't die. But I imagine it's things like that. It's things like Sapphiron or maybe Kel'Thuzad. Those are like the shake-up fights. But other than that, like Tier 1 or Phase 1, however you want to call it, those raids don't really need to be that difficult. Think about it. If you've played WoW just in general for most of the XPACs that got released, there hasn't really been a super difficult Phase 1 or Tier 1 raid where you were like, man, this tier was crazy. I wonder what's gonna happen next. It really hasn't been like that. If anything, it's been the opposite. Like, I remember the Emerald Nightmare and Legion just being laughably easy, even on Mythic mode, right? Uldir in BFA was pretty easy, right? High Maul was pretty easy, even though High Maul did have like High Maul had the last fight, King Mulgar. His fight was pretty cool, especially on Mythic mode where Cho'Gall came out. Like that, I don't think was a super easy fight, but I want to say maybe the quote-unquote hardest tier 1 or phase 1 raid, if you want to call it that, probably was Castle Nathria, to be quite honest with you, because Mythic Stone Legion, that fight was pretty tough. Sludge Fist was meant to be like not a super tough fight. Like the patchwork fights normally aren't super tough. They just have one damning mechanic that will wipe you or your raid if you mess it up. But even Sludge Fist was a pretty damning fight. Like the ballroom dance fight, I can't remember what it's called, but that fight was a pretty damning fight if you didn't get it right. So I think, as crazy as that sounds, the most recent X-Pack probably had the hardest first tier raid. I might do a tier list on that. Like, what is the hardest like first tier raids? Food for thought. I'm write that down. Anyway, so back to Wrath Classic. Yeah, I don't know what I was expecting. I guess maybe I was hoping that the 30% buff was just more than what it should have been, and that's my fault, right? So here we have the DPS rankings and class guides for, Nax, EOE, and OS. And I'll say that in both percentiles, like the high percentile and the overall statistics, I kind of expected it to be what it is. In overall damage, we have Demo Lock Unholy, Death Knight, Aflock, Assassination Rogue, Frost DK, and Enhanced Shaman, right? And that's just like the top 5 or 6. And this is kind of what I expected. I kind of already knew the Warlocks and the Death Knights would be the high performers. I think everyone pretty much assumed Assassin Rogue would be a higher performer. So this isn't shocking to me. Even Enhanced Shaman, like, that's not shocking to me. What I didn't expect, at least for overall, was for arms to be the lowest. That kind of surprised me a little bit. Not really surprised me, but it was like, that's interesting. Like, arms to be the lowest. What also surprised me, I guess, was the fact that Fire and Arcane aren't as far apart when it comes to overall damage, right? I expected kind of Boomkin and Arcane Mage to be middle of the pack, which is kind of where they're at for overall. But just seeing how close Fire and Arcane is, that's kind of shocking to me. When we look at damage to bosses, same thing. Like, I kind of expected Affliction to be on top if the 30% nerf buff worked out. Like, if bosses have more health, more fight times, more execution times, kind of works in Affliction Lock's favor. But that's not to say that Demo doesn't have its own strong execution either. So Demo being up top doesn't really surprise me. Assassin Rogue, nope. Unholy DK, nope. Aflock, nope. Destruction Lock's interesting when it comes to bosses. Like, Destruction was never bad. I think it just got overshadowed by the other 2 specs. So I've always said that. Like, I don't think Destruction is a bad spec. I just think it gets overshadowed by the other 2 specs and doesn't really bring anything outside of like a replenishment effect that the other Warlocks can't bring, right? You're not gonna want, a 3rd or 4th replenishment in place of Demonic Pact, right? So that's not a thing. But yeah, damage to bosses, kind of what I expected for the top performing classes. Really surprised that Pharaoh wasn't as high as what it should be. Like, coming from War Main and stuff like that, if you do a little research, you've probably heard that Feral is a super high single target spec, right? And I think it is. I think why we're not seeing those results, more or less, and I'm not a Feral Druid master or anything like that, but just a raider outside looking in. I think we haven't seen that is, one, I think probably the scripting on Omen of Clarity is different from what it was on War Main, right? Hence why we have so many different quote-unquote weave options, right? So with Feral Druid, you have the traditional kitty stuff, the rotation priority, but then you have bear weaving, which really isn't too crazy. Like, it's really like the concept of it is, if you expend all your energy and you're waiting, you shift into bear form, hidden ability, shift back into cat form when you have the energy, right? So I'm super simplifying it, but that's really the gist of the situation. But then you add on things like flower weaving or wrath weaving, right? And I feel like those things can take away from the general idea of the Pharaoh Druid. And what I mean by that is keeping up your dots, keeping up Savage Roar, prioritizing Shred, things like that. But when you're focused on, all right, I expended all my energy, I gotta come out of cat form, cast Gift of the Wild, hope I get an Omen of Clarity proc, get back into cat form, hit Shred. There's a lot of variables that can mess you up while doing that. Same thing with Wrath Weaving. If you come out of form to cast that Omen of Clarity, cast that Gift of the Wild to hit a Wrath, like it's weird. It gets skewed. Like, I had watched Crix's video where it was him, I think Sarth was there, Nerd Egghead was there, and there was another druid, I can't remember the name, but they're all talking about Pharaoh Druid, and I was just listening to it like, my God, this is what Pharaoh DPS is supposed to do. Like, it was just like brain frying, and I was like, this is a lot. Like, the word weaving has never been said so much in conversation more than what I've heard in that video. Like, it was crazy. And I think that leads on to a bigger issue, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. I just want to get through this DPS stuff. But yeah, other than like Pharaoh being low, think Pharaoh is like slightly above BM Hunter and Frost Mage, which were just deemed as bad specs, and both of those and sub are over Retribution Paladin and Fury Warrior and Arms Warrior. So it's like damage to bosses. I didn't expect the bottom tier. I expected the top tier. Didn't really expect what I was seeing in the bottom tier. The percentiles, same thing. Like, I'm not going to rehash that. We can actually close that out. But yeah, so I think to wrap this up, Naxx, Eye of Eternity, Obsidian Sanctum, even though I'm incredibly bored with it, even though I've cleared all of these raids, like we cleared it all week 1, and that's probably what the average guild is doing. Like, they're killing all of Naxx, all of both Malygos and Nartharion, or Sartharion, not Nartharion, not Deathwing, Sartharion. They're killing all the bosses in 1 week and then going, now what? So I don't know. It is what it is. I think the saving throw here is that you can do 10 men as well. So if you have an alt that you've leveled, or if you just want another piece of gear, you're gearing an off spec, you can go into 10 men and get what you want, right? But yeah, that's really it for phase 1. For those still progressing, don't let what I say, downplay it. Progress, see it through. See the phase through. For those who are like me, I cleared all the bosses and it's like, now what? Looking ahead the next 3 months, like looking at my watch thinking, yo, is Ulduar out yet? Hang tight. This is what we knew phase 1 would be. Pretty much gear your character up and hang tight, right? The next thing I want to talk about has to do with, well, in part, the weaving aspect, like kind of what I mentioned with the Pharaoh Druids and their various weaving mechanics, and really just talking about what people deem degenerative gameplay as a whole, right? Because I had seen all of the videos where it's like, all right, the best way to be, an engineer is to put hyperspeed accelerators on your gloves and then have another pair of gloves with the same thing in your bag so you can switch them out. Same thing with, the rocket boots. Same thing with, if you're using the pyro rocket, the hand-mounted pyro rocket. And when people were labeling it like degenerative, like I would see YouTube videos and like in the comments they would be like, here's the top 1%, or here's the sweaty gamers making degenerative gameplay a norm. I understand the sentiment, but I think they're explaining it wrong. So I don't know if I call glove weaving or boot weaving or whatever you want to call it. I'm sick of weaving. I don't know if I would call it degenerative, but it can be destructive to a community. And what I mean by that is, going back to a Pharaoh Druid, right? Let's say, knowing what we know about Pharaoh Druid, we know the priority in its rotation, we know the various things you can do to proc Omen of Clarity, and coupled with that, now we know that if you're an engineer, which I'm assuming you should be on a Pharaoh Druid as a Pharaoh DPS, you can now do this glove weaving thing where you can snapshot an even bigger rip with more haste, so on and so forth. Or if you're a warlock, like if you want me to move from Pharaoh Druid, you can get a big snapshot on a warlock in the opener because you're switching out gloves and stuff like that. And the concept, again, it's not a hard thing to grasp. You use something before combat starts, you switch it, and when combat starts, you still have the buff from the previous gloves, but now you have new gloves on that you can actually use in combat. So it's not a hard thing to conceptualize, and even in execution, I don't even think it's that difficult. Maybe for some classes or some players, if you're new to a certain class, it might be difficult to get the execution right, but after practice, you'll get it. Like, you know what I mean? So I don't know if I call that degenerative, but it may not be the way that Blizzard wants you to play that certain spec. And I think they kind of answered that when they nerfed the engineering tinkering. So now you can't switch out, old hyperspeed accelerator gloves for new ones before combat, right? You can't switch out nitro boots. You can't do anything with the engineer stuff. So I think in Blizzard's mind, it might be deemed as degenerative. I don't know if I call it that because it's still improving your gameplay. That's why I wouldn't call it that. Like, you effectively glove weaving will get you a bigger snapshot on a dot class, which will lead to more damage. I don't know if I would call that degenerative if you're improving your performance. However, it doesn't feel the greatest. It doesn't feel the greatest that you have to do all these little intricacies, and maybe for some guilds that's the expectation. In my guild it isn't. I wasn't expecting all of our engineers to have a second pair and do all that. Like, it's Naxx, Eye of Eternity, and Obsidian Sanctum. Like, relax, my guy. Like, I wasn't expecting all that. But some guilds might be. They might be in that environment where if you don't even think about glove weaving, you'll get the F out. Like, we ain't playing with you. So I could see where maybe the after effects of glove weaving and things like it can be deemed as degenerative. I don't know if the actual action of glove weaving can be deemed as degenerative. The next thing is like people blaming, like, the sweaties or the top guild or the top 1 or 2%, whatever you want to call it, them blaming them, like the people who aren't rating in that high level, blaming the top for this kind of gameplay. And it's like, well, you could look at it like that. The way I choose to look at it is like this, right? Let's take a guild like Fusion. They're a pretty known guild. They're pretty high up there. They have good execution rates. I would consider them as part of the top echelon of rating guilds, right? If you have Fusion, who's doing all of these things, they have a Pharaoh Druid who's, weaving to his heart's content and trying to make it work. Bear weaving, glove weaving, flower weaving, whatever you want to do it. They have Warlocks who are glove weaving. They have all of their DPS who are all engineers and jewel crafters and enchanters using Saronite bombs on everything and all of this stuff. Everything, right? They post their logs. And now other guilds are looking at it and saying, all right, let's see what these guys are doing. And if I come from, Joe and the Boys guild, right? And we're seeing Fusion do all of these things, is it Fusion's fault that if me as an officer or as a GM of Joe and the Boys, the guild, if I'm the GM or an officer of there, and I now instill the actions that Fusion is doing into my own raid group, whose fault is that? Because that's really what's going on. It's not just in Classic, it's in retail too. Like, whenever the top guilds post something or do something or post their raid comp, there's a trickle down effect. Like, it was always a thing where either Limit or Method, they would post, like, when they get their world first kills or whatever, they would show their raid comp, and a person would say, oh, they don't have a Ret Paladin. Ret Paladin's bad. Is Ret Paladin bad because the number 1 guild in the world didn't bring one? That's what you surmise from that? And now it makes you, if you're playing a Ret Paladin, feel away. So it's like, I don't know. But it's like, why compare yourself to that when you know you're not that? Why compare yourself to the number 1 guild or the number 2 guild or the top 10 guilds when you know you're not even remotely in that space? You're just here to clear the content. You're not even racing for your own server first. So why even care? Why even put that extra added stress on yourself? That's how I tend to look at things. I'm not gonna pretend to be something if I know I'm not in that space. Now, if I'm aspiring to be in that space, different story. If I'm looking to make my guild as best as I can be, different story. But you got to pick your battles, in my opinion. Like, I'm not saying you shouldn't aspire to be great, but your aspirations shouldn't take away from the overall gameplay and the feel of your raid group. Because to be quite honest, you can still kill whatever boss you want in phase 1 and phase 2, whatever phase, all of Wrath Classic. You can kill whatever boss you want without adopting some of the top end strategies. That's just a fact. You can go into Naxx with 25 druids and clear it just fine. That's just a fact. So when people adopt the top end strategies but then blame the top end for posting the strategies, it's like no one's telling you to play like them. That's how I look at it. You can have a different opinion, let me know in the comments below, but that's how I tend to look at things. It's like I don't blame the top end or the top 1% or the top 10 raiders or the top 100 guilds. I don't blame them for implementing these strategies because they're clearly in a space or in an environment that I'm not a part of. Now, if I want to be a part of that environment, then yeah, do what you got to do. But if I'm not and I don't aspire to be like that, if I just want to be a good guild who's clearing content, I don't have to adopt every single thing that they're doing. So it just kind of confuses me when people blame the top end or call them degenerative or call them sweaty, whatever you want to do, for practices that they don't have to follow behind. That's just how I feel about it. And the last thing I want to touch base on is really just asking what you guys think about phase 1 and your experiences with it. How was your gear grind? How was your leveling process? So on and so forth. Like, I feel like I probably took maybe the more traditional quote unquote path of leveling. Like, I started with the dungeon grinding group. We grinded till about 77 together, and then we kind of like broke off into our own spaces. And I know people who just did, quest lines by themselves solo. I know people who just found good farming spots, right? And yeah, I mean, I don't think I took a traditional leveling aspect, but I think it was pretty similar to a lot of people. So I want to know what you guys think. How's phase 1 been treating you? Do you think it's too easy? You think it's too hard? You think it should have been buffed? If it got buffed 30%, do you think that 30 should have been more like 60? That's how I'm feeling. But yeah, I really want to know. And with that being said, that's really the end of the video. I thank you guys for sticking it out with me this long. I thank all of the new subscribers, viewing the content, liking it, commenting on it. I really didn't see this channel being, but knocking on, 600 subs door. Like, I just kind of did this for fun. Like, I just like WoW so much and I like Warcraft content that I was like, yo, I want to put out some stuff. I didn't really think that the channel would grow as much as what it has been. So I really want to thank everyone who's been subscribing and supporting. You really don't know how much that means, but without further ado, as always, you guys have been great. I've been Soul and I'm out. Peace.